A continuation of extractive institutions, this time of the Jim Crow kind rather than of slavery, emerged in the South. The phrase Jim Crow, which supposedly originated from a Jump Jim Crow, an early 19th century satire of black people performed by white performers in blackface, came to refer to the whole gamut of segregationist legislation that was enacted in the South after 1865. These persisted for almost another century, until yet another major upheaval, the Civil Rights Movement. In the meantime, blacks continued to be excluded from power and repressed. Plantation-type agriculture based on low-wage, poorly educated labor persisted, and Southern incomes fell further relative to the U.S. average. The vicious circle of extractive institutions was stronger than many had expected at the time. The reason that the economic and political trajectory of the South never changed, even though slavery was abolished and black men were given the right to vote, was because blacks' political power and economic independence were tenuous. The Southern planters lost the war, but would win the peace. They were still organized and they still owned the land. During the war, freed slaves had been offered the promise of 40 acres and a mule when slavery was abolished, and some even got it during the famous campaigns of General William T. Sherman. But in 1865, President Andrew Johnson revoked Sherman's orders, and the hoped-for land redistribution never took place. In a debate on this issue in Congress, Congressman George Washington Julian presciently noted, "Of what avail would be an act of Congress totally abolishing slavery? If the old agricultural basis of aristocratic power shall remain?" This was the beginning of the redemption of the Old South and the persistence of the old Southern landed elite. The sociologist Jonathan Weiner studied the persistence of the planter elite in 5 counties of the Black Belt, prime cotton country, of southern Alabama. Tracking families from the U.S. Census and considering those with at least $10,000 of real estate, he found that of the 236 members of the planter elite in 1850, 101 maintained their position in 1870. Interestingly, this rate of persistence was very similar to that experienced in the pre-Civil War period. Of the 236 wealthiest planter families of 1850, only 110 remained so a decade later. Nevertheless, of the 25 planters with the largest landholdings in 1870, 72% had been in the elite families in 1860, 16 had been in the 1850 elite group. While more than 600,000 were killed in the Civil War, the planter elites suffered few casualties. The law, designed by the planters and for the planters, exempted 1 slaveholder from military service for every 20 slaves held. As hundreds of thousands of men died to preserve the Southern plantation economy, many big slaveholders and their sons sat out the war on their porches and thus were able to ensure the persistence of the plantation economy. After the end of the war, the elite planters controlling the land were able to re-exert their control over the labor force. Though the economic institution of slavery was abolished, the evidence shows a clear line of persistence in the economic system of the South based on plantation-type agriculture with cheap labor. This economic system was maintained through a variety of channels, including both control of local politics and exercise of violence. As a consequence, in the words of the African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, the South became simply an armed camp for intimidating black folk. In 1865, the state legislature of Alabama passed the Black Code, an important landmark toward the repression of black labor. Similar to Decree 177 in Guatemala, the Black Code of Alabama consisted of a vagrancy law and a law against the enticement of laborers. It was designed to impede labor mobility and reduce competition in the labor market, and it ensured that Southern planters would still have a reliable low-cost labor pool. Following the Civil War, the period called Reconstruction lasted from 1865 until 1877. Northern politicians, with the help of the Union Army, engineered some social changes in the South. But a systematic backlash from the Southern elite in the guise of support for the so-called Redeemers, seeking the South's redemption, recreated the old system. In the 1877 presidential election, Rutherford Hayes needed Southern support in the Electoral College. This college, still used today, was at the heart of the indirect election for president created by the U.S. Constitution. Citizens' votes do not directly elect the president but instead elect electors who then choose the president in the Electoral College, in exchange for their support. In the Electoral College, the Southerners demanded that Union soldiers be withdrawn from the South and the region left to its own devices. Hayes agreed. With Southern support, Hayes became president and pulled out the troops. The period after 1877 then marked the real re-emergence of the pre-Civil War planter elite. The redemption of the South involved the introduction of new poll taxes and literacy tests for voting, which systematically disenfranchised blacks, and often also the poor white population. These attempts succeeded and created a one-party regime under the Democratic Party, with much of the political power vested in the hands of the planter elite. The Jim Crow laws created separate, and predictably inferior, schools. Alabama, for example, rewrote its constitution in 1901 to achieve this. Shockingly, even today Section 256 of Alabama's constitution, though no longer enforced, still states, "Duty of legislature to establish and maintain public school system, apportionment of public school fund, separate schools for white and colored children. The legislature shall establish, organize, and maintain a liberal system of public schools throughout the state for the benefit of the children thereof, between the ages of 7 and 21 years. The public school fund shall be apportioned to the several counties in proportion to the number of school children of school age therein, and shall be so apportioned to the schools in the districts or townships in the counties as to provide, as nearly as practicable, school terms of equal duration in such school districts or townships. Separate schools shall be provided for white and colored children. And no child of either race shall be permitted to attend a school of the other race." An amendment to strike Section 256 from the Constitution was narrowly defeated in the state legislature in 2004. Disenfranchisement, the vagrancy laws such as the Black Code of Alabama, various Jim Crow laws, and the actions of the Ku Klux Klan, often financed and supported by the elite, turned the post-Civil War South into an effective apartheid society, where blacks and whites lived different lives. As in South Africa, these laws and practices were aimed at controlling the black population and its labor. Southern politicians in Washington also worked to make sure that the extractive institutions of the South could persist. For instance, they ensured that no federal projects or public works that would have jeopardized Southern elite control over the black workforce ever got approved. Consequently, the South entered the 20th century as a largely rural society with low levels of education and backward technology, still employing hand labor and mule power virtually unassisted by mechanical implements. Though the proportion of people in urban areas increased, it was far less than in the North. In 1900, for example, 13.5% of the population of the South was urbanized, as compared with 60% in the Northeast. All in all, the extractive institutions in the southern United States, based on the power of the landed elite, Plantation agriculture, and low-wage, low-education labor, persisted well into the 20th century. These institutions started to crumble only after the Second World War and then truly after the Civil Rights Movement destroyed the political basis of the system. And it was only after the demise of these institutions in the 1950s and 60s that the South began its process of rapid convergence to the North. The U.S. South shows another, more resilient side of the vicious circle, as in Guatemala. The Southern planter elite remained in power and structured economic and political institutions in order to ensure the continuity of its power. But differently from Guatemala, it was faced with significant challenges after its defeat in the Civil War, which abolished slavery and reversed the total, constitutional exclusion of blacks from political participation. But there is more than one way of skinning a cat. As long as the planter elite was in control of its huge landholdings and remained organized, it could structure a new set of institutions, Jim Crow instead of slavery, to achieve the same objective. The vicious circle turned out to be stronger than many, including Abraham Lincoln, had thought. The vicious circle is based on extractive political institutions creating extractive economic institutions, which in turn support the extractive political institutions, because economic wealth and power buy political power. When 40 acres and a mule was off the table, the Southern planter elite's economic power remained untarnished. And, unsurprisingly and unfortunately, the implications for the black population of the South, and the South's economic development, were the same. The Iron Law of Oligarchy. The Solomonic dynasty in Ethiopia lasted until it was overthrown by a military coup in 1974. The coup was led by the Derg, a group of Marxist army officers. The regime that the Derg pitched from power looked like it was frozen in some earlier century, a historical anachronism. The Emperor Haile Selassie would start his day by arriving in the courtyard at the Grand Palace, which had been built by Emperor Menelik II in the late 19th century. Outside the palace would be a crowd of dignitaries anticipating his arrival, bowing and desperately trying to get his attention. The emperor would hold court in the audience hall, sitting on the imperial throne. Selassie was a small man, so that his legs were not left swinging in the air. It was the job of a special pillow-bearer to accompany him wherever he went to make sure there was a suitable pillow to put under his feet. The bearer kept a stock of 52 pillows to cope with any situation. Selassie presided over an extreme set of extractive institutions and ran the country as his own private property, handing out favors and patronage and ruthlessly punishing lack of loyalty. There was no economic development to speak of in Ethiopia under the Solomonic dynasty. The Derg initially formed out of 108 representatives of different military units from all over the country. The representative of the 3rd Division in Harar Province was a major named Mengistu Haile Mariam. Though in their initial declaration of July 4, 1974, the Derg officers declared their loyalty to the emperor, they soon started to arrest members of the government, testing how much opposition it would create. As they became more confident that the support for Selassie's regime was hollow, they moved on the emperor himself, arresting him on September 12. Then the executions began. Many politicians at the core of the old regime were swiftly killed. By December, the Derg had declared that Ethiopia was a socialist state. Selassie died, probably murdered, on August 27, 1975. In 1975 the Derg started nationalizing property, including all urban and rural land and most kinds of private property. The increasingly authoritarian behavior of the regime sparked opposition around the country. Large parts of Ethiopia were put together during the European colonial expansion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, by the policies of Emperor Menelik II, the victor of the Battle of Adawa, which we encountered before, page 237. These included Eritrea and Tigray in the north and the Ogaden in the east. Independence movements in response to the Derg's ruthless regime emerged in Eritrea and Tigray, while the Somali army invaded the Somali-speaking Ogaden. The Derg itself started to disintegrate and split into factions. Major Mengistu turned out to be the most ruthless and clever of them. By mid-1977 he had eliminated his major opponents and effectively taken charge of the regime, which was saved from collapse only by a huge influx of weapons and troops from the Soviet Union and Cuba later, in November of that year. In 1978 the regime organized a national celebration marking the 4th anniversary of the overthrow of Haile Selassie. By this time Mengistu was the unchallenged leader of the Derg. As his residence, the place from where he would rule Ethiopia, he had chosen Selassie's Grand Palace, left unoccupied since the monarchy was abolished. At the celebration, he sat on a gilded armchair, just like the emperors of old, watching the parade. Official functions were now held once again at the Grand Palace, with Mengistu sitting on Haile Selassie's old throne. Mengistu started to compare himself to Emperor Tawadros, who had refounded the Solomonic dynasty in the mid-19th century after a period of decline. One of his ministers, Dawit Wolde Georges, recalled in his memoir, "At the beginning of the revolution all of us had utterly rejected anything to do with the past. We would no longer drive cars, or wear suits, neckties were considered criminal. Anything that made you look well off or bourgeois, anything that smacked of affluence or sophistication, was scorned as part of the old order." Then, around 1978, all that began to change. Gradually materialism became accepted, then required. Designer clothes from the best European tailors were the uniform of all senior government officials, and members of the military council. We had the best of everything. The best homes, the best cars, the best whiskey, champagne, food. It was a complete reversal of the ideals of the revolution. Georges also vividly recorded how Mengistu changed once he became sole ruler. The real Mengistu emerged, vengeful, cruel, and authoritarian. Many of us who used to talk to him with hands in our pockets, as if he were one of us, found ourselves standing stiffly to attention, cautiously respectful in his presence. In addressing him we had always used the familiar form of you, Auntie. Now we found ourselves switching to the more formal you, Erziwo. He moved into a bigger, more lavish office in the palace of Menelik. He began using the emperor's cars. We were supposed to have a revolution of equality. Now he had become the new emperor. The pattern of vicious circle depicted by the transition between Haile Selassie and Mengistu, or between the British colonial governors of Sierra Leone and Siaka Stevens, is so extreme and at some level so strange that it deserves a special name. As we already mentioned in Chapter 4, the German sociologist Robert Michels called it the iron law of oligarchy. The internal logic of oligarchies, and in fact of all hierarchical organizations, is that, argued Michels, they will reproduce themselves not only when the same group is in power, but even when an entirely new group takes control. What Michels did not anticipate perhaps was an echo of Karl Marx's remark that history repeats itself, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. It is not only that many of the post-independence leaders of Africa moved into the same residences, made use of the same patronage networks, and employed the same ways of manipulating markets and extracting resources. as had the colonial regimes and the emperors they replaced, but they also made things worse. It was indeed a farce that the staunchly anti-colonial Stephens would be concerned with controlling the same people, the Mende, whom the British had sought to control, that he would rely on the same chiefs whom the British had empowered and then used to control the hinterland, that he would run the economy in the same way, expropriating the farmers with the same marketing boards and controlling the diamonds under a similar monopoly. It was indeed a farce, a very sad farce indeed, that Laurent Kabila, who mobilized an army against Mobutu's dictatorship with the promise of freeing the people and ending the stifling and impoverishing corruption and repression of Mobutu's Zaire, would then set up a regime just as corrupt and perhaps even more disastrous. It was certainly farcical that he tried to start a Mobutu-esque personality cult aided and abetted by Dominique Sakambi Inongo, previously Mobutu's Minister of Information, and that Mobutu's regime was itself fashioned on patterns of exploitation of the masses that had started more than a century previously with King Leopold's Congo Free State. It was indeed a farce that the Marxist officer Mengistu would start living in a palace, viewing himself as an emperor, and enriching himself and his entourage just like Haile Selassie and other emperors before him had done. It was all a farce, but also more tragic than the original tragedy, and not only for the hopes that were dashed. Stephens and Kabila, like many other rulers in Africa, would start murdering their opponents and then innocent citizens. Mengistu and the Derg's policies would bring recurring famine to Ethiopia's fertile lands. History was repeating itself, but in a very distorted form. It was a famine in Wollo province in 1973 to which Haile Selassie was apparently indifferent that did so much finally to solidify opposition to his regime. Selassie had at least been only indifferent. Mengistu instead saw famine as a political tool to undermine the strength of his opponents. History was not only farcical and tragic, but also cruel to the citizens of Ethiopia and much of sub-Saharan Africa. The essence of the iron law of oligarchy, this particular facet of the vicious circle, is that new leaders overthrowing old ones with promises of radical change bring nothing but more of the same. At some level, the iron law of oligarchy is harder to understand than other forms of the vicious circle. There is a clear logic to the persistence of the extractive institutions in the U.S. South and in Guatemala. The same groups continued to dominate the economy and the politics for centuries. Even when challenged, as the U.S. Southern planters were after the Civil War, their power remained intact and they were able to keep and recreate a similar set of extractive institutions, from which they would again benefit. But how can we understand those who come to power in the name of radical change creating the same system? The answer to this question reveals, once again, that the vicious circle is stronger than it first appears. Not all radical changes are doomed to failure. The Glorious Revolution was a radical change, and it led to what perhaps turned out to be the most important political revolution of the past 2 millennia. The French Revolution was even more radical, with its chaos and excessive violence and the ascent of Napoleon Bonaparte, but it did not recreate the Ancien regime. 3 factors greatly facilitated the emergence of more inclusive political institutions following the Glorious Revolution and the French Revolution. The first was new merchants and businessmen wishing to unleash the power of creative destruction from which they themselves would benefit. These new men were among the key members of the revolutionary coalitions and did not wish to see the development of yet another set of extractive institutions that would again prey on them. The second was the nature of the broad coalition that had formed in both cases. For example, the Glorious Revolution wasn't a coup by a narrow group or a specific narrow interest, but a movement backed by merchants, industrialists, the gentry, and diverse political groupings. The same was largely true for the French Revolution. The third factor relates to the history of English and French political institutions. They created a background against which new, more inclusive regimes could develop. In both countries there was a tradition of parliaments and power sharing going back to the Magna Carta in England, and to the Assembly of Notables in France. Moreover, both revolutions happened in the midst of a process that had already weakened the grasp of the absolutist, or aspiring absolutist, regimes. In neither case would these political institutions make it easy for a new set of rulers or a narrow group to take control of the state, and usurp existing economic wealth and build unchecked and durable political power. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, a narrow group under the leadership of Robespierre and Saint-Just did take control, with disastrous consequences, but this was temporary and did not derail the path toward more inclusive institutions. All this contrasts with the situation of societies with long histories of extreme extractive economic and political institutions, and no checks on the power of rulers. In these societies, there would be no new strong merchants or businessmen supporting and bankrolling the resistance against the existing regime in part, to secure more inclusive economic institutions, no broad coalitions introducing constraints against the power of each of their members, no political institutions inhibiting new rulers intent on usurping and exploiting power. In consequence, in Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, and the Congo, the vicious circle would be far harder to resist, and moves toward inclusive institutions far more unlikely to get underway. There were also no traditional or historical institutions that could check the power of those who would take control of the state. Such institutions had existed in some parts of Africa, and some, as in Botswana, even survived the colonial era. But they were much less prominent throughout Sierra Leone's history, and to the extent that they existed, they were warped by indirect rule. The same was true in other British colonies in Africa, such as Kenya and Nigeria. They never existed in the absolutist kingdom of Ethiopia. In the Congo, indigenous institutions were emasculated by Belgian colonial rule and the autocratic policies of Mobutu. In all these societies, there were also no new merchants, businessmen, or entrepreneurs supporting the new regimes and demanding secure property rights and an end to previous extractive institutions. In fact, the extractive economic institutions of the colonial period meant that there was not much entrepreneurship, or business left at all. The international community thought that post-colonial African independence would lead to economic growth, through a process of state planning and cultivation of the private sector. But the private sector was not there, except in rural areas, which had no representation in the new governments and would thus be their first prey. Most important perhaps, in most of these cases there were enormous benefits from holding power. These benefits both attracted the most unscrupulous men, such as Stevens, who wished to monopolize this power, and brought the worst out of them once they were in power. There was nothing to break the vicious circle. Negative feedback and vicious circles. Rich nations are rich largely because they managed to develop inclusive institutions at some point during the past 300 years. These institutions have persisted through a process of virtuous circles. Even if inclusive only in a limited sense to begin with, and sometimes fragile, they generated dynamics that would create a process of positive feedback, gradually increasing their inclusiveness. England did not become a democracy after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Far from it. Only a small fraction of the population had formal representation, but crucially, she was pluralistic. Once pluralism was enshrined, there was a tendency for the institutions to become more inclusive over time, even if this was a rocky and uncertain process. In this, England was typical of virtuous circles. Inclusive political institutions create constraints against the exercise and usurpation of power. They also tend to create inclusive economic institutions, which in turn make the continuation of inclusive political institutions more likely. Under inclusive economic institutions, wealth is not concentrated in the hands of a small group that could then use its economic might to increase its political power disproportionately. Furthermore, under inclusive economic institutions there are more limited gains from holding political power, thus weaker incentives for every group and every ambitious, upstart individual to try to take control of the state. A confluence of factors at a critical juncture, including interplay between existing institutions and the opportunities and challenges brought by the critical juncture, is generally responsible for the onset of inclusive institutions, as the English case demonstrates. But once these inclusive institutions are in place, we do not need the same confluence of factors for them to survive. Virtuous circles, though still subject to significant contingency, enable the institution's continuity and often even unleash dynamics taking society toward greater inclusiveness. As virtuous circles make inclusive institutions persist, vicious circles create powerful forces toward the persistence of extractive institutions. History is not destiny, and vicious circles are not unbreakable, as we will see further in Chapter 14. But they are resilient. They create a powerful process of negative feedback, with extractive political institutions forging extractive economic institutions, which in turn create the basis for the persistence of extractive political institutions. We saw this most clearly in the case of Guatemala, where the same elite held power, first under colonial rule, then in independent Guatemala. For more than 4 centuries, extractive institutions enrich the elite, and their wealth forms the basis for the continuation of their domination. The same process of the vicious circle is also apparent in the persistence of the plantation economy in the U.S. South, except that it also showcases the vicious circle's great resilience in the face of challenges. U.S. Southern planters lost their formal control of economic and political institutions after their defeat in the Civil War. Slavery, which was the basis of the plantation economy, was abolished, and blacks were given equal political and economic rights. Yet the Civil War did not destroy the political power of the planter elite or its economic basis, and they were able to restructure the system, under a different guise but still under their own local political control, and to achieve the same objective, abundance of low-cost labor for the plantations. This form of the vicious circle, where extractive institutions persist because the elite controlling them and benefiting from them persists, is not its only form. At first a more puzzling, but no less real and no less vicious, form of negative feedback shaped the political and economic development of many nations, and is exemplified by the experiences of much of sub-Saharan Africa, in particular Sierra Leone and Ethiopia. In a form that the sociologist Robert Michaels would recognize as the iron law of oligarchy, the overthrow of a regime presiding over extractive institutions heralds the arrival of a new set of masters, to exploit the same set of pernicious extractive institutions. The logic of this type of vicious circle is also simple to understand in hindsight. Extractive political institutions create few constraints on the exercise of power, so there are essentially no institutions to restrain the use and abuse of power by those overthrowing previous dictators, and assuming control of the state, and extractive economic institutions imply that there are great profits and wealth to be made merely by controlling power, expropriating the assets of others, and setting up Monopolies. Of course, the iron law of oligarchy is not a true law, in the sense that the laws of physics are. It does not chart an inevitable path, as the Glorious Revolution in England or the Meiji Restoration in Japan illustrate. A key factor in these episodes, which saw a major turn toward inclusive institutions, was the empowerment of a broad coalition that could stand up against absolutism and would replace the absolutist institutions by more inclusive, pluralistic ones. A revolution by a broad coalition makes the emergence of pluralistic political institutions much more likely. In Sierra Leone and Ethiopia, the iron law of oligarchy was made more likely not only because existing institutions were highly extractive, but also because neither the independence movement in the former nor the Derg coup in the latter were revolutions led by such broad coalitions, but rather by individuals and groups seeking power so that they could do the extracting. There is yet another, even more destructive facet of the vicious circle, anticipated by our discussion of the Maya city-states in Chapter 5. When extractive institutions create huge inequalities in society and great wealth and unchecked power for those in control, there will be many wishing to fight to take control of the state and institutions. Extractive institutions then not only pave the way for the next regime, which will be even more extractive, but they also engender continuous infighting and civil wars. These civil wars then cause more human suffering and also destroy even what little state centralization these societies have achieved. This also often starts a process of descent into lawlessness, state failure, and political chaos, crushing all hopes of economic prosperity, as the next chapter will illustrate. Why Nations Fail. The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. By Darren Acemoglu and James A. Robinson. 13. Why Nations Fail Today. Institutions, institutions, institutions. 13. Why Nations Fail Today. How to Win the Lottery in Zimbabwe. It was January 2000 in Harare, Zimbabwe. Master of Ceremonies Falet Chihuahua was in charge of drawing the winning ticket for the national lottery, organized by a partly state-owned bank, the Zimbabwe Banking Corporation, Zimbank. The lottery was open to all clients who had kept 5,000 or more Zimbabwe dollars in their accounts during December 1999. When Chihuahua drew the ticket, he was dumbfounded. As the public statement of Zimbank put it, Master of Ceremonies Falet Chihuahua could hardly believe his eyes when the ticket drawn for the $100,000 prize was handed to him and he saw His Excellency R.G. Mugabe written on it. President Robert Mugabe, who had ruled Zimbabwe by hook or by crook, and usually with an iron fist, since 1980, had won the lottery, which was worth 100,000 Zimbabwe dollars, about 5 times the annual per capita income of the country. Zimbank claimed that Mr. Mugabe's name had been drawn from among thousands of eligible customers. What a lucky man. Needless to say, he didn't really need the money. Mugabe had in fact only recently awarded himself and his cabinet salary hikes of up to 200%. The lottery ticket was just one more indication of Zimbabwe's extractive institutions. One could call this corruption, but it is just a symptom of the institutional malaise in Zimbabwe. The fact that Mugabe could even win the lottery if he wanted showed how much control he had over matters in Zimbabwe, and gave the world a glimpse of the extent of the country's extractive institutions. The most common reason why nations fail today is because they have extractive institutions. Zimbabwe under Mugabe's regime vividly illustrates the economic and social consequences. Though the national statistics in Zimbabwe are very unreliable, The best estimate is that by 2008, Zimbabwe's per capita income was about half of what it was when the country gained its independence in 1980. Dramatic as this sounds, it does not in fact begin to capture the deterioration in living standards in Zimbabwe. The state has collapsed and more or less stopped providing any basic public services. In 2008 to 2009, the deterioration in the health systems led to an outbreak of cholera across the country. As of January 10, 2010, there have been 98,741 reported cases and 4,293 deaths, making it the deadliest cholera outbreak in Africa over the previous 15 years. In the meantime, mass unemployment has also reached unprecedented levels. In early 2009, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs claimed that the unemployment rate had hit an incredible 94%. The roots of many economic and political institutions in Zimbabwe, as is the case for much of sub-Saharan Africa, can be traced back to the colonial period. In 1890, Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company sent a military expedition into the then Kingdom of the Ndebele, based in Matabeleland, and also into the neighboring Mashonaland. Their superior weaponry quickly suppressed African resistance, and by 1901 the colony of Southern Rhodesia, named after Rhodes, had been formed in the area that is currently Zimbabwe. Now that the area was a privately owned concession of the British South Africa Company, Rhodes anticipated making money there through prospecting and mining for precious minerals. The ventures never got off the ground, but the very rich farmlands began attracting white migration. These settlers soon annexed much of the land. By 1923 they had freed themselves from the rule of the British South Africa Company and persuaded the British government to grant them self-government. What then occurred is very similar to what had happened in South Africa a decade or so previously. The 1913 Natives Land Act, pages 265 to 266, created a dual economy in South Africa. Rhodesia passed very similar laws, and inspired by the South African model, a white-only apartheid state was constructed soon after 1923. As the European colonial empires collapsed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the white elite in Rhodesia, led by Ian Smith, comprising possibly 5% of the population, declared independence from Britain in 1965. Few international governments recognized Rhodesia's independence, and the United Nations levied economic and political sanctions against it. The black citizens organized a guerrilla war from bases in the neighboring countries of Mozambique and Zambia. International pressure and the rebellion waged by the two main groups, Mugabe's ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union, and ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, led by Joshua Komu, resulted in a negotiated end to white rule. The state of Zimbabwe was created in 1980. After independence, Mugabe quickly established his personal control. He either violently eliminated his opponents or co-opted them. The most egregious acts of violence happened in Matabeleland, the heartland of support for ZAPU, where as many as 20,000 people were killed in the early 1980s. By 1987 ZAPU had merged with ZANU to create ZANU-PF, and Joshua Komu was sidelined politically. Mugabe was able to rewrite the constitution he had inherited as a part of the independence negotiation, making himself president. He had started as prime minister, abolishing white voter rolls that were part of the independence agreement, and eventually, in 1990, getting rid of the Senate altogether and introducing positions in the legislature that he could nominate. A de facto one-party state headed by Mugabe was the result. Upon independence, Mugabe took over a set of extractive economic institutions created by the white regime. These included a host of regulations on prices and international trade, state-run industries, and the obligatory agricultural marketing boards. State employment expanded rapidly, with jobs given to supporters of ZANU-PF. The tight government regulation of the economy suited the ZANU-PF elites because it made it difficult for an independent class of African businessmen, who might then have challenged the former's political monopoly, to emerge. This was very similar to the situation we saw in Ghana in the 1960s in Chapter 2, pages 64 to 68. Ironically, of course, this left whites as the main business class. During this period, the main strengths of the white economy, particularly the highly productive agricultural export sector, was left untouched. But this would last only until Mugabe became unpopular. The model of regulation and market intervention gradually became unsustainable, and a process of institutional change, with the support of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, began in 1991 after a severe fiscal crisis. The deteriorating economic performance finally led to the emergence of a serious political opposition to ZANU-PF's one-party rule, the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC. The 1995 parliamentary elections were far from competitive. ZANU-PF won 81% of the vote and 118 out of the 120 seats. 55 of these members of parliament were elected unopposed. The presidential election the following year showed even more signs of irregularities and fraud. Mugabe won 93% of the vote, but his two opponents, Abel Muzorewa and Dabaningi Sithole, had already withdrawn their candidacy prior to the election, accusing the government of coercion and fraud. After 2000, despite all the corruption, ZANU-PF's grip was weakening. It took only 49% of the popular vote, and only 63 seats. All were contested by the MDC, who took every seat in the capital, Harare. In the presidential election of 2002, Mugabe scraped home with only 56% of the vote. Both sets of elections went ZANU-PF's way only because of violence and intimidation, coupled with electoral fraud. The response of Mugabe to the breakdown of his political control was to intensify both the repression and the use of government policies to buy support. He unleashed a full-scale assault on white landowners. Starting in 2000, he encouraged and supported an extensive series of land occupations and expropriations. They were often led by war veterans associations, groups supposedly comprised of former combatants in the War of Independence. Some of the expropriated land was given to these groups, but much of it also went to the ZANU-PF elites. The insecurity of property rights wrought by Mugabe and ZANU-PF led to a collapse of agricultural output and productivity. As the economy crumbled, the only thing left was to print money to buy support, which led to enormous hyperinflation. In January 2009, it became legal to use other currencies, such as the South African rand, and the Zimbabwean dollar vanished from circulation, a worthless piece of paper. What happened in Zimbabwe after 1980 was commonplace in sub-Saharan Africa since independence. Zimbabwe inherited a set of highly extractive political and economic institutions in 1980. For the first decade and a half, these were maintained relatively untouched. While elections took place, political institutions were anything but inclusive. Economic institutions changed somewhat. For example, there was no longer explicit discrimination against blacks. But on the whole the institutions remained extractive, with the only difference being that instead of Ian Smith and the whites doing the extracting, it was Robert Mugabe and the ZANU-PF elites filling their pockets. Over time the institutions became even more extractive, and incomes in Zimbabwe collapsed. The economic and political failure in Zimbabwe is yet another manifestation of the iron law of oligarchy, in this instance, with the extractive and repressive regime of Ian Smith being replaced by the extractive, corrupt, and repressive regime of Robert Mugabe. Mugabe's fake lottery win in 2000 was then simply the tip of a very corrupt and historically shaped iceberg. Nations fail today because their extractive economic institutions do not create the incentives needed for people to save, invest, and innovate. Extractive political institutions support these economic institutions by cementing the power of those who benefit from the extraction. Extractive economic and political institutions, though their details vary under different circumstances, are always at the root of this failure. In many cases, for example, as we will see in Argentina, Colombia, and Egypt, this failure takes the form of lack of sufficient economic activity, because the politicians are just too happy to extract resources or quash any type of independent economic activity that threatens themselves and the economic elites. In some extreme cases, as in Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone, which we discuss next, extractive institutions pave the way for complete state failure, destroying not only law and order but also even the most basic economic incentives. The result is economic stagnation and, as the recent history of Angola, Cameroon, Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, Liberia, Nepal, Sierra Leone, Sudan, and Zimbabwe illustrates, civil wars, mass displacements, famines, and epidemics, making many of these countries poorer today than they were in the 1960s. A Children's Crusade? On March 23, 1991, a group of armed men under the leadership of Foday Sankoh crossed the border from Liberia into Sierra Leone and attacked the southern frontier town of Kailahun. Sankoh, formerly a corporal in the Sierra Leonean army, had been imprisoned after taking part in an abortive coup against Siaka Stevens's government in 1971. After being released, he eventually ended up in Libya, where he entered a training camp that the Libyan dictator Colonel Gaddafi ran for African revolutionaries. There he met Charles Taylor, who was plotting to overthrow the government in Liberia. When Taylor invaded Liberia on Christmas Eve 1989, Sankoh was with him, and it was with a group of Taylor's men, mostly Liberians and Burkinabes, citizens of Burkina Faso, that Sankoh invaded Sierra Leone. They called themselves the RUF, the Revolutionary United Front, and they announced that they were there to overthrow the corrupt and tyrannical government of the APC. As we saw in the previous chapter, Siaka Stevens and his All People's Congress, the APC, took over and intensified the extractive institutions of colonial rule in Sierra Leone, just as Mugabe and ZANU-PF did in Zimbabwe. By 1985, when Stevens, ill with cancer, brought in Joseph Momoh to replace him, the economy was collapsing. Stevens, apparently without irony, used to enjoy quoting the aphorism, "The cow eats where it is tethered." And where Stevens had once eaten, Momoh now gorged. The roads fell to pieces, and schools disintegrated. National television broadcasts stopped in 1987, when the transmitter was sold by the Minister of Information, and in 1989 a radio tower that relayed radio signals outside Freetown fell down, ending transmissions outside the capital. An analysis published in a newspaper in the capital city of Freetown in 1995 rings very true. By the end of Momoh's rule he had stopped paying civil servants, teachers, and even paramount chiefs. Central government had collapsed, and then of course we had border incursions, rebels, and all the automatic weapons pouring over the border from Liberia. The NPRC, the rebels, and the Sobels, soldiers turned rebels, all amount to the chaos one expects when government disappears. None of them are the causes of our problems, but they are symptoms. The collapse of the state under Momo, once again a consequence of the vicious circle unleashed by the extreme extractive institutions under Stevens, meant that there was nothing to stop the RUF from coming across the border in 1991. The state had no capacity to oppose it. Stevens had already emasculated the military, because he worried they might overthrow him. It was then easy for a relatively small number of armed men to create chaos in most of the country. They even had a manifesto called Footpaths to Democracy, which started with a quote from the black intellectual Frantz Fanon: "Each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it." The section, "What are we fighting for?" begins. We continue to fight because we are tired of being perpetual victims of state-sponsored poverty and human degradation, visited on us by years of autocratic rule and militarism. But we shall exercise restraint and continue to wait patiently at the rendezvous of peace, where we shall all be winners. We are committed to peace, by any means necessary, but what we are not committed to is becoming victims of peace. We know our cause to be just, and God/Allah will never abandon us in our struggle to reconstruct a new Sierra Leone. Though Senko and other RUF leaders may have started with political grievances, and the grievances of the people suffering under the APC's extractive institutions may have encouraged them to join the movement. Early on, the situation quickly changed and spun out of control. The mission of the RUF plunged the country into agony, as in the testimony of a teenager from Gioma, in the south of Sierra Leone. They gathered some of us. They chose some of our friends and killed them, 2 of them. These were people whose fathers were the chiefs, and they had soldiers' boots and property in their houses. They were shot, for no other reason than that they were accused of harboring soldiers. The chiefs were also killed, as part of the government. They chose someone to be the new chief. They were still saying they had come to free us from the APC. After a point, they were not choosing people to kill, just shooting people. In the first year of the invasion, any intellectual roots that the RUF may have had were completely extinguished. Senko executed those who criticized the mounting stream of atrocities. Soon, few voluntarily joined the RUF. Instead, they turned to forcible recruitment, particularly of children. Indeed, all sides did this, including the army. If the Sierra Leonean Civil War was a crusade to build a better society, in the end it was a children's crusade. The conflict intensified with massacres and massive human rights abuses, including mass rapes and the amputation of hands and ears. When the RUF took over areas, they also engaged in economic exploitation. It was most obvious in the diamond mining areas, where they press-ganged people into diamond mining, but was widespread elsewhere as well. The RUF wasn't alone in committing atrocities, massacres, and organized forced labor. The government did so as well. Such was the collapse of law and order that it became difficult for people to tell who was a soldier and who was a rebel. Military discipline completely vanished. By the time the war ended in 2001, probably 80,000 people had died and the whole country had been devastated. Roads, houses, and buildings were entirely destroyed. Today, if you go to Koidu, a major diamond-producing area in the east, you'll still see rows of burned-out houses scarred with bullet holes. By 1991 the state in Sierra Leone had totally failed. Think of what King Shyam started with the Bushang. Pages 133 to 136. He set up extractive institutions to cement his power, and extract the output the rest of society would produce. But even extractive institutions with central authority concentrated in his hands were an improvement over the situation, without any law and order, central authority, or property rights that characterized the Lele society on the other side of the river Kasai. Such lack of order and central authority has been the fate of many African nations in recent decades, partly because the process of political centralization was historically delayed in much of sub-Saharan Africa, but also because the vicious circle of extractive institutions reversed any state centralization that existed, paving the way for state failure. Sierra Leone during her bloody civil war of 10 years, from 1991 to 2001, was a typical case of a failed state. It started out as just another country marred by extractive institutions, albeit of a particularly vicious and inefficient type. Countries become failed states not because of their geography or their culture, but because of the legacy of extractive institutions, which concentrate power and wealth in the hands of those controlling the state, opening the way for unrest, strife, and civil war. Extractive institutions also directly contribute to the gradual failing of the state by neglecting investment in the most basic public services, exactly what happened in Sierra Leone. Extractive institutions that expropriate and impoverish the people and block economic development are quite common in Africa, Asia, and South America. Charles Taylor helped to start the civil war in Sierra Leone while at the same time initiating a savage conflict in Liberia, which led to state failure there, too. The pattern of extractive institutions collapsing into civil war and state failure has happened elsewhere in Africa, for example, in Angola, Côte d'Ivoire, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mozambique, Republic of Congo, Somalia, Sudan, and Uganda. Extraction paves the way for conflict, not unlike the conflict that the highly extractive institutions of the Maya city-states generated almost 1,000 years ago. Conflict precipitates state failure. So another reason why nations fail today is that their states fail. This, in turn, is a consequence of decades of rule under extractive economic and political institutions. Who is the state? The cases of Zimbabwe, Somalia, and Sierra Leone, even if typical of poor countries in Africa, and perhaps even some in Asia, seem rather extreme. Surely Latin American countries do not have failed states? Surely their presidents are not brazen enough to win the lottery? In Colombia, the Andean mountains gradually merge to the north with a large coastal plain that borders the Caribbean Ocean. Colombians call this the Tierra Caliente, the hot country, as distinct from the Andean world of the Tierra Fria, the cold country. For the last 50 years, Colombia has been regarded by most political scientists and governments as a democracy. The United States feels happy to negotiate a potential free trade agreement with the country and pours all kinds of aid into it, particularly military aid. After a short-lived military government, which ended in 1958, elections have been regularly held, even though until 1974 a pact rotated political power and the presidency between the two traditional political parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals. Still, this pact, the National Front, was itself ratified by the Colombian people via a plebiscite, and this all seems democratic enough. Yet while Colombia has a long history of democratic elections, it does not have inclusive institutions. Instead, its history has been marred by violations of civil liberties, extrajudicial executions, violence against civilians, and civil war. Not the sort of outcomes we expect from a democracy. The civil war in Colombia is different from that in Sierra Leone, where the state and society collapsed and chaos reigned. But it is a civil war nonetheless, and one that has caused far more casualties. The military rule of the 1950s was itself partially in response to a civil war known in Spanish simply as la violencia, or the violence. Since that time, quite a range of insurgent groups, mostly communist revolutionaries, have plagued the countryside, kidnapping and murdering. To avoid either of these unpleasant options in rural Colombia, you have to pay the vacuna, literally, the vaccination, meaning that you have to vaccinate yourself against being murdered or kidnapped by paying off some group of armed thugs each month. Not all armed groups in Colombia are communists. In 1981, members of the main communist guerrilla group in Colombia, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, kidnapped a dairy farmer, Jesus Castano, who lived in a small town called Amalfi in the hot country in the northeastern part of the department of Antioquia. The FARC demanded a ransom amounting to $7,500, a small fortune in rural Colombia. The family raised it by mortgaging the farm, but their father's corpse was found anyway, chained to a tree. Enough was enough for three of Castano's sons, Carlos, Fidel, and Vicente. They founded a paramilitary group, Los Tangueros, to hunt down members of the FARC and avenge this act. The brothers were good at organizing, and soon their group grew and began to find a common interest with other similar paramilitary groups that had developed from similar causes. Colombians in many areas were suffering at the hands of left-wing guerrillas, and right-wing paramilitaries formed in opposition. Paramilitaries were being used by landowners to defend themselves against the guerrillas, but they were also involved in drug trafficking, extortion, and the kidnapping and murder of citizens. By 1997, the paramilitaries, under the leadership of the Castano brothers, had managed to form a national organization for paramilitaries called the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, the AUC, United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. The AUC expanded into large parts of the country, particularly into the hot country, in the departments of Córdoba, Sucre, Magdalena, and Cesar. By 2001, the AUC may have had as many as 30,000 armed men at its disposal, and was organized into different blocks. In Córdoba, the paramilitary Bloc A Catatumbo was led by Salvatore Mancuso. As its power continued to grow, the AUC made a strategic decision to get involved in politics. Paramilitaries and politicians courted each other. Several of the leaders of the AUC organized a meeting with prominent politicians in the town of Santa Fe de Relito in Córdoba. A joint document, a pact, calling for the refounding of the country, was issued and signed by leading members of the AUC, such as Jorge Forti, the nickname for Rodrigo Tovar Pupo, Adolfo Paz, a nom de guerre for Diego Fernando Udon Berna, Murillo, and Diego Vecino, real name, Edward Cobo Tellez, along with politicians, including national senators William Montes and Miguel de la Espriella. By this point, the AUC was running large tracts of Colombia, and it was easy for them to fix who got elected in the 2002 elections for the Congress and Senate. For example, in the municipality of San Onofre, in Sucre, the election was arranged by the paramilitary leader Cadena, Chain. One eyewitness described what happened as follows. The trucks sent by Cadena went around the neighborhoods, corregimientos, and rural areas of San Onofre picking people up. According to some inhabitants, For the 2002 elections, hundreds of peasants were taken to the Corregimiento Plan Parejo, so they could see the faces of the candidates they had to vote for in the parliamentarian elections: Jairo Merlano for Senate and Muriel Benito Rebollo for Congress. Cadena put in a bag the names of the members of the municipal council, took out 2 and said that he would kill them and other people chosen randomly if Muriel did not win. The threat seems to have worked. Each candidate obtained 40,000 votes in the whole of Sucre. It is no surprise that the mayor of San Onofre signed the Pact of Santa Fe de Relito. Probably 1/3 of the congressmen and senators owed their election in 2002 to paramilitary support. And Map 20, page 380, which depicts the areas of Colombia under paramilitary control, shows how widespread their hold was. Salvatore Mancuso himself put it in an interview in the following way. 35% of the Congress was elected in areas where there were states of the self-defense groups. In those states we were the ones collecting taxes, we delivered justice, and we had the military and territorial control of the region. And all the people who wanted to go into politics had to come and deal with the political representatives we had there. It is not difficult to imagine the effect of this extent of paramilitary control of politics and society on economic institutions and public policy. The expansion of the AUC was not a peaceful affair. The group not only fought against the FARC, but also murdered innocent civilians and terrorized and displaced hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, of the Norwegian Refugee Council, in early 2010 around 10% of Colombia's population, nearly 4.5 million people, was internally displaced. The paramilitaries also, as Mancuso suggested, took over the government and all its functions, except that the taxes they collected were just expropriation for their own pockets. An extraordinary pact between the paramilitary leader Martín Llanos, real name, Hector German Buitrago, and the mayors of the municipalities of Torremina, Alguazil, Mani, Villanueva, Monterrey, and Sabanalarga, in the department of Casanare in eastern Colombia, lists the following rules to which the mayors had to adhere by order of the paramilitary peasants of Casanare. Map 20, Paramilitary Presence Across Colombia, 1997 to 2005. 9. Give 50% of the municipality budget to be managed by the paramilitary peasants of Casanare. 10. 10% of each and every contract of the municipality to be given to the paramilitary peasants of Casanare. 11. Mandatory assistance to all the meetings called by the paramilitary peasants of Casanare. 12. Inclusion of the paramilitary peasants of Casanare in every infrastructure project. 13. Affiliation to the new political party formed by the paramilitary peasants of Casanare. 14. Accomplishment of his/hers governance program. Casanare is not a poor department. On the contrary, it has the highest level of per capita income of any Colombian department, because it has significant oil deposits, just the kind of resources that attract paramilitaries. In fact, once they gained power, the paramilitaries intensified their systematic expropriation of property. Mancuso himself reputedly accumulated $25 million worth of urban and rural property. Estimates of land expropriated in Colombia by paramilitaries are as high as 10% of all rural land. Colombia is not a case of a failed state about to collapse. But it is a state without sufficient centralization and with far from complete authority over all its territory. Though the state is able to provide security and public services in large urban areas such as Bogotá and Barranquilla, there are significant parts of the country where it provides few public services and almost no law and order. Instead, alternative groups and people, such as Mancuso, control politics and resources. In parts of the country, economic institutions function quite well, and there are high levels of human capital and entrepreneurial skill. In other parts, the institutions are highly extractive, even failing to provide a minimal degree of state authority. It might be hard to understand how a situation like this can sustain itself for decades, even centuries. But in fact, the situation has a logic of its own, as a type of vicious circle. Violence, and the absence of centralized state institutions of this type enter into a symbiotic relationship with politicians running the functional parts of the society. The symbiotic relationship arises because national politicians exploit the lawlessness in peripheral parts of the country, while paramilitary groups are left to their own devices by the national government. This pattern became particularly apparent in the 2000s. In 2002, the presidential election was won by Álvaro Uribe. Uribe had something in common with the Castano brothers. His father had been killed by the FARC. Uribe ran a campaign repudiating the attempts of the previous administration to try to make peace with the FARC. In 2002, his vote share was 3 percentage points higher in areas with paramilitaries than without them. In 2006, when he was re-elected, his vote share was 11 percentage points higher in such areas. If Mancuso and his partners could deliver the vote for Congress and the Senate, they could do so in presidential elections as well, particularly for a president strongly aligned with their worldview and likely to be lenient on them. As Jairo Angarita, Salvatore Mancuso's deputy and the former leader of the AUC's Sinu and San Jorge blocs, declared in September 2005, he was proud to work for the re-election of the best president we have ever had. Once elected, the paramilitary senators and congressmen voted for what Uribe wanted, in particular changing the constitution so that he could be re-elected in 2006, which had not been allowed at the time of his first election, in 2002. In exchange, President Uribe delivered a highly lenient law that allowed the paramilitaries to demobilize. Demobilization did not mean the end of paramilitarism, simply its institutionalization in large parts of Colombia and the Colombian state, which the paramilitaries had taken over and were allowed to keep. In Colombia, many aspects of economic and political institutions have become more inclusive over time. But certain major extractive elements remain. Lawlessness and insecure property rights are endemic in large swaths of the country, and this is a consequence of the lack of control by the national state in many parts of the country, and the particular form of lack of state centralization in Colombia. But this state of affairs is not an inevitable outcome. It is itself a consequence of dynamics mirroring the vicious circle. Political institutions in Colombia do not generate incentives for politicians to provide public services and law and order in much of the country, and do not put enough constraints on them to prevent them from entering into implicit or explicit deals with paramilitaries and thugs. El Corralito. Argentina was in the grip of an economic crisis in late 2001. For 3 years, income had been falling, unemployment had been rising, and the country had accumulated a massive international debt. The policies leading to this situation were adopted after 1989 by the government of Carlos Menem, to stop hyperinflation and stabilize the economy. For a time they were successful. In 1991, Menem tied the Argentine peso to the US dollar. 1 peso was equal to $1 by law. There was to be no change in the exchange rate. End of story. Well, almost. To convince people that the government really meant to stick to the law, it persuaded people to open bank accounts in US dollars. Dollars could be used in the shops of the capital city of Buenos Aires and withdrawn from cash machines all over the city. This policy may have helped stabilize the economy, but it had one big drawback. It made Argentine exports very expensive and foreign imports very cheap. Exports dribbled to a halt, imports gushed in. The only way to pay for them was to borrow. It was an unsustainable situation. As more people began worrying about the sustainability of the peso, they put more of their wealth into dollar accounts at banks. After all, if the government ripped up the law and devalued the peso, they would be safe with dollar accounts, right? They were right to be worried about the peso. But they were too optimistic about their dollars. On December 1, 2001, the government froze all bank accounts, initially for 90 days. Only a small amount of cash was allowed for withdrawal on a weekly basis. First it was 250 pesos, still worth $250, then 300 pesos. But this was allowed to be withdrawn only from peso accounts. Nobody was allowed to withdraw money from their dollar accounts, unless they agreed to convert the dollars into pesos. Nobody wanted to do so. Argentines dubbed this situation El Corralito, the little corral. Depositors were hemmed into a corral like cows, with nowhere to go. In January the devaluation was finally enacted, and instead of there being 1 peso for $1, there were soon 4 pesos for $1. This should have been a vindication of those who thought that they should put their savings in dollars. But it wasn't, because the government then forcibly converted all the dollar bank accounts into pesos, but at the old 1-for-1 exchange rate. Someone who had had $1,000 saved suddenly found himself with only $250. The government had expropriated 3/4 of people's savings. For economists, Argentina is a perplexing country. To illustrate how difficult it was to understand Argentina, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Simon Kuznets once famously remarked that there were 4 sorts of countries: developed, underdeveloped, Japan, and Argentina. Kuznets thought so because, around the time of the First World War, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. It then began a steady decline relative to the other rich countries in Western Europe and North America, which turned, in the 1970s and 80s, into an absolute decline. On the surface of it, Argentina's economic performance is puzzling. But the reasons for its decline become clearer when looked at through the lens of inclusive and extractive institutions. It is true that before 1914, Argentina experienced around 50 years of economic growth, but this was a classic case of growth under extractive institutions. Argentina was then ruled by a narrow elite heavily invested in the agricultural export economy. The economy grew by exporting beef, hides, and grain in the middle of a boom in the world prices of these commodities. Like all such experiences of growth under extractive institutions, it involved no creative destruction and no innovation. And it was not sustainable. Around the time of the First World War, mounting political instability and armed revolts induced the Argentine elites to try to broaden the political system, but this led to the mobilization of forces they could not control, and in 1930 came the first military coup. Between then and 1983, Argentina oscillated backward and forward between dictatorship and democracy and between various extractive institutions. There was mass repression under military rule, which peaked in the 1970s with at least 9,000 people and probably far more being illegally executed. Hundreds of thousands were imprisoned and tortured. During the periods of civilian rule there were elections, a democracy of sorts. But the political system was far from inclusive. Since the rise of Perón in the 1940s, democratic Argentina has been dominated by the political party he created, the Partido Justicialista, usually just called the Peronist Party. The Peronists won elections thanks to a huge political machine, which succeeded by buying votes, dispensing patronage, and engaging in corruption, including government contracts and jobs in exchange for political support. In a sense this was a democracy, but it was not pluralistic. Power was highly concentrated in the Peronist Party, which faced few constraints on what it could do, at least in the period when the military restrained from throwing it from power. As we saw earlier, pages 329 to 332, if the Supreme Court challenged a policy, so much the worse for the Supreme Court. In the 1940s, Perón had cultivated the labor movement as a political base. When it was weakened by military repression in the 1970s and 80s, his party simply switched to buying votes from others instead. Economic policies and institutions were designed to deliver income to their supporters, not to create a level playing field. When President Menem faced a term limit that kept him from being re-elected in the 1990s, it was just more of the same. He could simply rewrite the constitution and get rid of the term limit. As El Corralito shows, even if Argentina has elections and popularly elected governments, the government is quite able to override property rights and expropriate its own citizens with impunity. There is little check on Argentine presidents and political elites, and certainly no pluralism. What puzzled Kuznets, and no doubt many others who visit Buenos Aires, is that the city seems so different from Lima, Guatemala City, or even Mexico City. You do not see indigenous people, and you do not see the descendants of former slaves. Mostly you see the glorious architecture and buildings put up during the Belle Epoque, the years of growth under extractive institutions. But in Buenos Aires you see only part of Argentina. Menem, for example, was not from Buenos Aires. He was born in Analaco, in the province of La Rioja, in the mountains far to the northwest of Buenos Aires, and he served 3 terms as governor of the province. At the time of the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish, this area of Argentina was an outlying part of the Inca Empire and had a dense population of indigenous people. See Map 1 on page 17. The Spanish created encomiendas here, and a highly extractive economy developed, growing food and breeding mules for the miners in Potosí to the north. In fact, La Rioja was much more like the area of Potosí in Peru and Bolivia than it was like Buenos Aires. In the 19th century, La Rioja produced the famous warlord Facundo Quiroga, who ruled the area lawlessly and marched his army on Buenos Aires. The story about the development of Argentine political institutions is a story about how the interior provinces, such as La Rioja, reached agreements with Buenos Aires. These agreements were a truce. The warlords of La Rioja agreed to leave Buenos Aires alone so that it could make money. In return, the Buenos Aires elites gave up on reforming the institutions of the interior. So Argentina at first appears a world apart from Peru or Bolivia, but it is really not so different once you leave the elegant boulevards of Buenos Aires. That the preferences and the politics of the interior got embedded into Argentine institutions is the reason why the country has experienced a very similar institutional path to those of other extractive Latin American countries. That elections have not brought either inclusive political or economic institutions is the typical case in Latin America. In Colombia, paramilitaries can fix 1/3 of national elections. In Venezuela today, As in Argentina, the democratically elected government of Hugo Chavez attacks its opponents, fires them from public sector jobs, closes down newspapers whose editorials it doesn't like, and expropriates property. In whatever he does, Chavez is much more powerful and less constrained than Sir Robert Walpole was in Britain in the 1720s, when he was unable to condemn John Huntridge under the Black Act, pages 302 to 308. Huntridge would have fared much less well in present-day Venezuela or Argentina. While the democracy emerging in Latin America is in principle diametrically opposed to elite rule, and in rhetoric and action it tries to redistribute rights and opportunities away from at least a segment of the elite, its roots are firmly based in extractive regimes in two senses. First, inequities persisting for centuries under extractive regimes make voters in newly emerging democracies vote in favor of politicians with extreme policies. It is not that Argentinians are just naive and think that Juan Perón or the more recent Peronist politicians such as Menem, or the Kirchners are selfless and looking out for their interests, or that Venezuelans see their salvation in Chavez. Instead, many Argentinians and Venezuelans recognize that all other politicians and parties have for so long failed to give them voice, to provide them with the most basic public services, such as roads and education, and to protect them from exploitation by local elites. So many Venezuelans today support the policies that Chavez is adopting even if these come with corruption and waste, in the same way that many Argentinians supported Perón's policies in the 1940s and 1970s. Second, it is again the underlying extractive institutions that make politics so attractive to, and so biased in favor of, strongmen such as Perón and Chavez, rather than an effective party system producing socially desirable alternatives. Perón, Chavez, and dozens of other strongmen in Latin America are just another facet of the iron law of oligarchy, and as the name suggests, the roots of this iron law lies in the underlying elite-controlled regimes. The new absolutism. In November 2009, the government of North Korea implemented what economists call a currency reform. Severe bouts of inflation are often the reasons for such reforms. In France in January 1960, a currency reform introduced a new franc that was equal to 100 of the existing francs. Old francs continued in circulation and people even quoted prices in them as the change to the new francs was gradually made. Finally, old francs ceased to be legal tender in January 2002, when France introduced the euro. The North Korean reform looked similar on the face of it. Like the French in 1960, the North Korean government decided to take 2 zeros off the currency. 100 old wons, the currency of North Korea, were to be worth 1 new won. Individuals were allowed to come forward to exchange their old currency for the newly printed currency, though this had to be done in 1 week, rather than 42 years, as in the French case. Then came the catch. The government announced that no one could convert more than 100,000 won, though it later relaxed this to 500,000. 100,000 won was about $40 at the black market exchange rate. In one stroke, the government had wiped out a huge fraction of North Korean citizens' private wealth. We do not know exactly how much, but it is probably greater than that expropriated by the Argentine government in 2002. The government in North Korea is a communist dictatorship opposed to private property and markets. But it is difficult to control black markets, and black markets make transactions in cash. Of course, quite a bit of foreign exchange is involved, particularly Chinese currency, but many transactions. Use 1. The currency reform was designed to punish people who used these markets and, more specifically, to make sure that they did not become too wealthy or powerful enough to threaten the regime. Keeping them poor was safer. Black markets are not the whole story. People in North Korea also keep their savings in wons because there are few banks in Korea, and they are all owned by the government. In effect, the government used the currency reform to expropriate much of people's savings. Though the government says it regards markets as bad, the North Korean elite rather like what markets can produce for them. The leader, Kim Jong-il, has a 7-story pleasure palace equipped with a bar, a karaoke machine, and a mini-movie theater. The ground floor has an enormous swimming pool with a wave machine, where Kim likes to use a bodyboard fitted with a small motor. When in 2006 the United States placed sanctions on North Korea, it knew how to really hit the regime where it hurt. It made it illegal to export more than 60 luxury items to North Korea, including yachts, water scooters, racing cars, motorcycles, DVD players, and televisions larger than 29 inches. There would be no more silk scarves, designer fountain pens, furs, or leather luggage. These were exactly the items collected by Kim and his Communist Party elites. One scholar used sales figures from the French company Hennessy to estimate that Kim's annual cognac budget before the sanctions could have been as high as $800,000 a year. It is impossible to understand many of the poorest regions of the world at the end of the 20th century without understanding the new absolutism of the 20th century, communism. Marx's vision was a system that would generate prosperity under more humane conditions and without inequality. Lenin and his Communist Party were inspired by Marx, but the practice could not have been more different from the theory. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was a bloody affair, and there was no humane aspect to it. Equality was not part of the equation, either, since the first thing Lenin and his entourage did was to create a new elite, themselves, at the head of the Bolshevik Party. In doing so, they purged and murdered not only non-communist elements, but also other communists who could have threatened their power. But the real tragedies were yet to come, first with the Civil War, and then under Stalin's collectivization and his all-too-frequent purges, which may have killed as many as 40 million people. Russian communism was brutal, repressive, and bloody, but not unique. The economic consequences and the human suffering were quite typical of what happened elsewhere, for example, in Cambodia in the 1970s under the Khmer Rouge, in China, and in North Korea. In all cases communism brought vicious dictatorships and widespread human rights abuses. Beyond the human suffering and carnage, the communist regimes all set up various types of extractive institutions. The economic institutions, with or without markets, were designed to extract resources from the people, and by entirely abhorring property rights, they often created poverty instead of prosperity. In the Soviet case, as we saw in Chapter 5, the communist system at first generated rapid growth, but then faltered and led to stagnation. The consequences were much more devastating in China under Mao, in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, and in North Korea, where the communist economic institutions led to economic collapse and famine. The communist economic institutions were in turn supported by extractive political institutions, concentrating all power in the hands of communist parties and introducing no constraints on the exercise of this power. Though these were different extractive institutions in form, they had similar effects on the livelihoods of the people as the extractive institutions in Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone. King Cotton. Cotton accounts for about 45% of the exports of Uzbekistan, making it the most important crop since the country established independence at the breakup of the Soviet Union. In 1991, under Soviet communism, all farmland in Uzbekistan was under the control of 2,048 state-owned farms. These were broken up and the land distributed after 1991. But that didn't mean farmers could act independently. Cotton was too valuable to the new government of Uzbekistan's first, and so far only, president, Ismail Karimov. Instead, regulations were introduced that determined what farmers could plant and exactly how much they could sell it for. Cotton was a valuable export, and farmers were paid a small fraction of world market prices for their crop, with the government taking the rest. Nobody would have grown cotton at the prices paid, so the government forced them. Every farmer now has to allocate 35% of his land to cotton. This caused many problems, difficulties with machinery being one. At the time of independence, about 40% of the harvest was picked by combine harvesters. After 1991, not surprisingly, given the incentives that President Karimov's regime created for farmers, they were not willing to buy these or maintain them. Recognizing the problem, Karimov came up with a solution, in fact, a cheaper option than combine harvesters, schoolchildren. The cotton bolls start to ripen and are ready to be picked in early September, at about the same time that children return to school. Karimov issued orders to local governors to send cotton delivery quotas to schools. In early September, the schools are emptied of 2.7 million children, 2006 figures. Teachers, instead of being instructors, became labor recruiters. Gulnaz, a mother of two of these children, explained what happens. At the beginning of each school year, approximately at the beginning of September, the classes in school are suspended, and instead of classes, children are sent to the cotton harvest. Nobody asks for the consent of parents. They don't have weekend holidays during the harvesting season. If a child is for any reason left at home, his teacher or class curator comes over and denounces the parents. They assign a plan to each child, from 20 to 60 kilograms per day depending on the child's age. If a child fails to fulfill this plan, then next morning he is lambasted in front of the whole class. The harvest lasts for 2 months. Rural children lucky enough to be assigned to farms close to home can walk or are bused to work. Children farther away or from urban areas have to sleep in the sheds or storehouses with the machinery and animals. There are no toilets or kitchens. Children have to bring their own food for lunch. The main beneficiaries from all this forced labor are the political elites, led by President Karimov, the de facto king of all Uzbeki cotton. The schoolchildren are supposedly paid for their labor, but only supposedly. In 2006, when the world price of cotton was around $1.40 US per kilo, the children were paid about 3 cents for their daily quota of 20 to 60 kilos. Probably 75% of the cotton harvest is now picked by children. In the spring, school is closed for compulsory hoeing, weeding, and transplanting. How did it all come to this? Uzbekistan, like the other Soviet socialist republics, was supposed to gain its independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union and develop a market economy and democracy. As in many other Soviet republics, this is not what happened, however. President Karimov, who began his political career in the Communist Party of the old Soviet Union, rising to the post of First Secretary for Uzbekistan at the opportune moment of 1989, just as the Berlin Wall was collapsing, managed to reinvent himself as a nationalist. With the crucial support of the security forces, in December 1991 he won Uzbekistan's first ever presidential election. After taking power, He cracked down on the independent political opposition. Opponents are now in prison or exile. There is no free media in Uzbekistan, and no non-governmental organizations are allowed. The apogee of the intensifying repression came in 2005, when possibly 750, maybe more, demonstrators were murdered by the police and army in Andijan. Using this command of the security forces and total control of the media, Karimov first extended his presidential term for 5 years, through a referendum, and then won re-election for a new 7-year term in 2000, with 91.2% of the vote. His only opponent declared that he had voted for Karimov. In his 2007 re-election, widely regarded as fraudulent, he won 88% of the vote. Elections in Uzbekistan are similar to those that Joseph Stalin used to organize in the heyday of the Soviet Union. One in 1937 was famously covered by New York Times correspondent Harold Denny, who reproduced a translation from Pravda, the newspaper of the Communist Party, which was meant to convey the tension and excitement of Soviet elections. Midnight has struck. The 12th of December, the day of the first general, equal and direct elections to the Supreme Soviet, has ended. The result of the voting is about to be announced. The commission remains alone in its room. It is quiet, and the lamps are shining solemnly. Amid the general attentive and intense expectation, the chairman performs all the necessary formalities before counting of the ballots, checking up by list how many voters there were and how many have voted, and the result is 100%. 100%. What election in what country for what candidate has given a 100% response? The main business starts now. Excitedly the chairman inspects the seals on the boxes. Then the members of the commission inspect them. The seals are intact and are cut off. The boxes are opened. It is quiet. They sit attentively and seriously, these election inspectors and executives. Now it is time to open the envelopes. 3 members of the commission take scissors. The chairman rises. The tellers have their copybooks ready. The first envelope is slit. All eyes are directed to it. The chairman takes out 2 slips, white, for a candidate for the Soviet of the Union, and blue, for a candidate for the Soviet of Nationalities, and reads loudly and distinctly, Comrade Stalin. Instantly the solemnity is broken. Everybody in the room jumps up and applauds joyously and stormily for the first ballot of the first general secret election, under the Stalinist constitution, a ballot with the name of the constitution's creator. This mood would have captured the suspense surrounding the re-elections of Karimov, who appears an apt pupil of Stalin when it comes to repression and political control and seems to organize elections that compete with those of Stalin in their surrealism. Under Karimov, Uzbekistan is a country with very extractive political and economic institutions. And it is poor. Probably 1/3 of the people live in poverty, and the average annual income is around $1,000. Not all the development indicators are bad. According to World Bank data, school enrollment is 100%, well, except possibly during the cotton picking season. Literacy is also very high, though apart from controlling all the media, the regime also bans books and censors the internet. While most people are paid only a few cents a day to pick cotton, the Karimov family and former communist cadres who reinvented themselves after 1989 as the new economic and political elites of Uzbekistan have become fabulously wealthy. The family economic interests are run by Karimov's daughter Gulnora, who is expected to succeed her father as president. In a country so untransparent and secretive, nobody knows exactly what the Karamov family controls or how much money they earn, but the experience of the U.S. company in Turspan is indicative of what has happened in the Uzbek economy in the last 2 decades. Cotton is not the only agricultural crop. Parts of the country are ideal for growing tea, and in Turspan decided to invest. By 2005 it had taken over 30% of the local market, but then it ran into trouble. Gulnora decided that the tea industry looked economically promising. Soon Interspan's local personnel started to be arrested, beaten up, and tortured. It became impossible to operate, and by August 2006 the company had pulled out. Its assets were taken over by the Karamov family's rapidly expanding tea interests, at the time representing 67% of the market, up from 2% a couple of years earlier. Uzbekistan in many ways looks like a relic from the past, a forgotten age. It is a country languishing under the absolutism of a single family and the cronies surrounding them, with an economy based on forced labor, in fact, the forced labor of children. Except that it isn't. It's part of the current mosaic of societies failing under extractive institutions, and unfortunately it has many commonalities with other former Soviet socialist republics, ranging from Armenia and Azerbaijan to Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, and reminds us that even in the 21st century, extractive economic and political institutions can take an unashamed, atrociously extractive form, keeping the playing field at an angle. The 1990s were a period of reform in Egypt. Since the military coup that removed the monarchy in 1954, Egypt had been run as a quasi-socialist society in which the government played a central role in the economy. Many sectors of the economy were dominated by state-owned enterprises. Over the years, the rhetoric of socialism lapsed, markets opened, and the private sector developed. Yet these were not inclusive markets, but markets controlled by the state and by a handful of businessmen allied with the National Democratic Party, NDP, the political party founded by President Anwar Sadat in 1978. Businessmen became more and more involved with the party, and the party became more and more involved with them under the government of Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak, who became president in 1981 following Anwar Sadat's assassination, ruled with the NDP until being forced from power by popular protests and the military in February 2011, as we discussed in the preface, page 1. Major businesspeople were appointed to key government posts in areas closely related to their economic interests. Rashid Mohammed Rashid, former president of Unilever AMET, Africa, Middle East, and Turkey, became Minister of Foreign Trade and Industry. Mohammed Zohair Wahid Garana, the owner and managing director of Garana Travel Company, one of the largest in Egypt, became Minister of Tourism. Amin Ahmed Mohammed Osman Abaza, founder of the Nile Cotton Trade Company, the largest cotton exporting company in Egypt, became Minister of Agriculture. In many sectors of the economy, businessmen persuaded the government to restrict entry through state regulation. These sectors included the media, iron and steel, the automotive industry, alcoholic beverages, and cement. Each sector was very concentrated with high entry barriers protecting the politically connected businessmen and firms. Big businessmen close to the regime, such as Ahmed Ez, iron and steel, the Soiris family, multimedia, beverages, and telecommunications, and Mohammed Nasir, beverages and telecommunications, received not only protection from the state but also government contracts and large bank loans without needing to put up collateral. Ahmed Ez was both the chairman of Ez Steel, the largest company in the country's steel industry, producing 70% of Egypt's steel, and also a high-ranking member of the NDP, the chairman of the People's Assembly Budget and Planning Committee, and a close associate of Gamal Mubarak, one of President Mubarak's sons. The economic reforms of the 1990s, promoted by international financial institutions and economists, were aimed at freeing up markets and reducing the role of the state in the economy. A key pillar of such reforms everywhere was the privatization of state-owned assets. Mexican privatization, pages 38 to 40, instead of increasing competition, simply turned state-owned monopolies into privately owned monopolies, in the process enriching politically connected businessmen such as Carlos Slim. Exactly the same thing took place in Egypt. The businesspeople connected to the regime were able to heavily influence implementation of Egypt's privatization program, so that it favored the wealthy business elite, or the whales, as they are known locally. At the time that privatization began, the economy was dominated by 32 of these whales. One was Ahmed Zayat, at the helm of the Luxor Group. In 1996 the government decided to privatize Al-Aram Beverages, ABC, which was the monopoly maker of beer in Egypt. A bid came in from a consortium of the Egyptian Finance Company, led by real estate developer Farid Saad, along with the first venture capital company formed in Egypt in 1995. The consortium included Fawad Sultan, former Minister of Tourism, Mohammed Nasir, and Mohammed Ragab, another elite businessman. The group was well connected, but not well connected enough. Its bid of 400 million Egyptian pounds was turned down as too low. Zayat was better connected. He didn't have the money to purchase ABC, so he came up with a scheme of Carlos Slim-type ingenuity. ABC shares were floated for the first time on the London Stock Exchange, and the Luxor Group acquired 74.9% of those shares at 68.5 Egyptian pounds per share. 3 months later the shares were then split in two, and the Luxor Group was able to sell all of them at £52.5 each, netting a 36% profit, with which Zayat was able to fund the purchase of ABC for £231 million the next month. At the time, ABC was making an annual profit of around 41.3 million Egyptian pounds, and had cash reserves of 93 million Egyptian pounds. It was quite a bargain. In 1999 the newly privatized ABC extended its monopoly from beer into wine, by buying the privatized national wine monopoly Gianaklis. Gianaklis was a very profitable company, nestling behind a 3,000% tariff imposed on imported wines, and it had a 70% profit margin on what it sold. In 2002 the monopoly changed hands again when Zayat sold ABC to Heineken for 1.3 billion Egyptian pounds. A 563% profit in 5 years. Mohammed Nasir hadn't always been on the losing side. In 1993 he purchased the privatized El Nasser Bottling Company, which had the monopoly rights to bottle and sell Coca-Cola in Egypt. Nasir's relations with the then Minister of the Public Business Sector, Atafi Bid, allowed him to make the purchase with little competition. Nasir then sold the company after 2 years for more than 3 times the acquisition price. Another example was the move in the late 1990s to involve the private sector in the state cinema industry. Again, political connections implied that only 2 families were allowed to bid for and operate the cinemas, one of whom was the Sawiris family. Egypt today is a poor nation, not as poor as most countries to the south, in sub-Saharan Africa, but still one where around 40% of the population is very poor and lives on less than $2 a day. Ironically, as we saw earlier, pages 61 to 62, In the 19th century, Egypt was the site of an initially successful attempt at institutional change and economic modernization, under Muhammad Ali, who did generate a period of extractive economic growth before it was effectively annexed to the British Empire. From the British colonial period, a set of extractive institutions emerged, and were continued by the military after 1954. There was some economic growth and investment in education, but the majority of the population had few economic opportunities, while the new elite could benefit from their connections to the government. These extractive economic institutions were again supported by extractive political institutions. President Mubarak planned to begin a political dynasty, grooming his son Gamal to replace him. His plan was cut short only by the collapse of his extractive regime in early 2011 in the face of widespread unrest and demonstrations during the so-called Arab Spring. During the period when Nasser was president, there were some inclusive aspects of economic institutions, and the state did open up the education system and provide some opportunities that the previous regime of King Farouk had not. But this was an example of an unstable combination of extractive political institutions, with some inclusivity of economic institutions. The inevitable outcome, which came during Mubarak's reign, was that economic institutions became more extractive, reflecting the distribution of political power in society. In some sense, the Arab Spring was a reaction to this. This was true not just in Egypt, but also in Tunisia. 3 decades of Tunisian growth under extractive political institutions started to go into reverse as President Ben Ali and his family began to prey more and more on the economy. Why nations fail? Nations fail economically because of extractive institutions. These institutions keep poor countries poor and prevent them from embarking on a path to economic growth. This is true today in Africa, in places such as Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone, in South America, in countries such as Colombia and Argentina, in Asia, in countries such as North Korea and Uzbekistan, and in the Middle East, in nations such as Egypt. There are notable differences among these countries. Some are tropical, some are in temperate latitudes. Some were colonies of Britain, others, of Japan, Spain, and Russia. They have very different histories, languages, and cultures. What they all share is extractive institutions. In all these cases, the basis of these institutions is an elite who design economic institutions in order to enrich themselves and perpetuate their power at the expense of the vast majority of people in society. The different histories and social structures of the countries lead to the differences in the nature of the elites and in the details of the extractive institutions. But the reason why these extractive institutions persist is always related to the vicious circle, and the implications of these institutions in terms of impoverishing their citizens are similar, even if their intensity differs. In Zimbabwe, for example, the elite comprise Robert Mugabe and the core of ZANU-PF, who spearheaded the anti-colonial fight in the 1970s. In North Korea, they are the clique around Kim Jong-il and the Communist Party. In Uzbekistan it is President Islam Karimov, his family, and his reinvented Soviet Union-era cronies. These groups are obviously very different, and these differences, along with the variegated polities and economies they govern, mean that the specific form the extractive institutions take differs. For instance, because North Korea was created by a communist revolution, it takes as its political model the one-party rule of the Communist Party. Though Mugabe did invite the North Korean military into Zimbabwe in the 1980s to massacre his opponents in Matabeleland, such a model for extractive political institutions is not applicable in Zimbabwe. Instead, because of the way he came to power in the anti-colonial struggle, Mugabe had to cloak his rule with elections, even if for a while he managed actually to engineer a constitutionally sanctified one-party state. In contrast, Colombia has had a long history of elections, which emerged historically as a method for sharing power between the liberal and conservative parties, in the wake of independence from Spain. Not only is the nature of elites different, but their numbers are. In Uzbekistan, Karimov could hijack the remnants of the Soviet state, which gave him a strong apparatus to suppress and murder alternative elites. In Colombia, the lack of authority of the central state in parts of the country has naturally led to much more fragmented elites, in fact, so much so that they sometimes murder one another. Nevertheless, despite these variegated elites and political institutions, these institutions often manage to cement and reproduce the power of the elite that created them. But sometimes the infighting they induce leads to the collapse of the state, as in Sierra Leone. Just as different histories and structures mean that the identity of elites and the details of extractive political institutions differ, so do the details of the extractive economic institutions that the elites set up. In North Korea, the tools of extraction were again inherited from the communist toolkit, the abolition of private property, state-run farms, and industry. In Egypt, the situation was quite similar under the avowedly socialist military regime created by Colonel Nasser, after 1952. Nasser sided with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, expropriating foreign investments, such as the British-owned Suez Canal, and took into public ownership much of the economy. However, the situation in Egypt in the 1950s and 60s was very different from that in North Korea in the 1940s. It was much easier for the North Koreans to create a more radically communist-style economy, since they could expropriate former Japanese assets and build on the economic model of the Chinese Revolution. In contrast, the Egyptian Revolution was more a coup by a group of military officers. When Egypt changed sides in the Cold War and became pro-Western, it was therefore relatively easy, as well as expedient, for the Egyptian military to change from central command to crony capitalism as a method of extraction. Even so, the better economic performance of Egypt compared with North Korea was a consequence of the more limited extractive nature of Egyptian institutions. For one thing, lacking the stifling control of the North Korean Communist Party, the Egyptian regime had to placate its population in a way that the North Korean regime does not. For another, even crony capitalism generates some incentives for investment, at least among those favored by the regime, that are totally absent in North Korea. Though these details are all important and interesting, the more critical lessons are in the big picture, which reveals that in each of these cases, extractive political institutions have created extractive economic institutions, transferring wealth and power toward the elite. The intensity of extraction in these different countries obviously varies and has important consequences for prosperity. In Argentina, for example, the constitution and democratic elections do not work well to promote pluralism, but they do function much better than in Colombia. At least the state can claim the monopoly of violence in Argentina. Partly as a consequence, income per capita in Argentina is double that of Colombia. The political institutions of both countries do a much better job of restraining elites than those in Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone, and as a result, Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone are much poorer than Argentina and Colombia. The vicious circle also implies that even when extractive institutions lead to the collapse of the state, as in Sierra Leone and Zimbabwe, this doesn't put a conclusive end to the rule of these institutions. We have already seen that civil wars and revolutions, while they may occur during critical junctures, do not necessarily lead to institutional change. The events in Sierra Leone since the civil war ended in 2002 vividly illustrate this possibility. In 2007, in a democratic election, the old party of Siaka Stevens, the APC, returned to power. Though the man who won the presidential election, Ernest Bai Koroma, had no association with the old APC governments, many of his cabinet did. Two of Stevens's sons, Bakari and Django, were even made ambassadors to the United States and Germany. In a sense, this is a more volatile version of what we saw happen in Colombia. There, the lack of state authority in many parts of the country persists over time, because it is in the interests of part of the national political elite to allow it to do so, but the core state institutions are also strong enough to prevent this disorder from turning into complete chaos. In Sierra Leone, partly because of the more extractive nature of economic institutions and partly because of the country's history of highly extractive political institutions, the society has not only suffered economically but has also tipped between complete disorder and some sort of order. Still, the long-run effect is the same: the state all but remains absent, and institutions are extractive. In all these cases there has been a long history of extractive institutions since at least the 19th century. Each country is trapped in a vicious circle. In Colombia and Argentina, they are rooted in the institutions of Spanish colonial rule, pages 9 to 19. Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone originated in British colonial regimes set up in the late 19th century. In Sierra Leone, in the absence of white settlers, these regimes built extensively on pre-colonial extractive structures of political power and intensified them. These structures themselves were the outcome of a long vicious circle that featured lack of political centralization, and the disastrous effects of the slave trade. In Zimbabwe, there was much more of a construction of a new form of extractive institutions, because the British South Africa Company created a dual economy. Uzbekistan could take over the extractive institutions of the Soviet Union and, like Egypt, modify them into crony capitalism. The Soviet Union's extractive institutions themselves were in many ways a continuation of those of the Tsarist regime, again in a pattern predicated on the iron law of oligarchy. As these various vicious circles played out in different parts of the world over the past 250 years, world inequality emerged, and persists. The solution to the economic and political failure of nations today is to transform their extractive institutions toward inclusive ones. The vicious circle means that this is not easy. But it is not impossible, and the iron law of oligarchy is not inevitable. Either some pre-existing inclusive elements in institutions, or the presence of broad coalitions leading the fight against the existing regime, or just the contingent nature of history, can break vicious circles. Just like the Civil War in Sierra Leone, the Glorious Revolution in 1688 was a struggle for power. But it was a struggle of a very different nature than the Civil War in Sierra Leone. Conceivably, some in Parliament fighting to remove James II in the wake of the Glorious Revolution imagined themselves playing the role of the new absolutist, as Oliver Cromwell did after the English Civil War. But the fact that Parliament was already powerful and made up of a broad coalition consisting of different economic interests and different points of view made the iron law of oligarchy less likely to apply in 1688. And it was helped by the fact that luck was on the side of Parliament against James II. In the next chapter, we will see other examples of countries that have managed to break the mold and transform their institutions for the better, even after a long history of extractive institutions. Why Nations Fail. The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. By Darren Acemoglu and James A. Robinson. 14. Breaking the Mold. How a few countries changed their economic trajectory by changing their institutions. 14. Breaking the Mold. 3 African Chiefs. On September 6, 1895, the ocean liner Tantallon Castle docked at Plymouth on the southern coast of England. 3 African chiefs, of the Ngwado, Bathoan of the Ngwaits, and Sebel of the Quina, disembarked and took the 8:10 express train to Paddington Station, London. The 3 chiefs had come to Britain on a mission, to save their and 5 other Tswana states from Cecil Rhodes. The Ngwado, Ngwaits, and Quina were 3 of the 8 Tswana states comprising what was then known as Bechuanaland, which would become Botswana after independence in 1966. The tribes had been trading with Europeans for most of the 19th century. In the 1840s, the famous Scottish missionary David Livingstone had travelled extensively in Bechuanaland and converted King Sechel of the Quina to Christianity. The first translation of the Bible into an African language was in Setswana, the language of the Tswana. In 1885 Britain had declared Bechuanaland a protectorate. The Tswana were content with the arrangement, as they thought this would bring them protection from further European invasions, particularly from the Boers, with whom they had been clashing since the Great Trek in 1835, a migration of thousands of Boers into the interior to escape from British colonialism. The British, on the other hand, wanted control of the area to block both further expansions by the Boers, pages 260 to 261, and possible expansions by Germans, who had annexed the area of southwest Africa corresponding to today's Namibia. The British did not think that a full-scale colonization was worthwhile. The High Commissioner Rae summarized the attitudes of the British government in 1885 clearly: "We have no interest in the country to the north of the Molope, the Bechuanaland Protectorate, except as a road to the interior. We might therefore confine ourselves for the present to preventing that part of the Protectorate being occupied by either filibusters, or foreign powers doing as little in the way of administration or settlement as possible." But things changed for the Tswana in 1889 when Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company started expanding north, out of South Africa, expropriating great swaths of land that would eventually become northern and southern Rhodesia, now Zambia and Zimbabwe. By 1895, the year of the 3 chiefs' visit to London, Rhodes had his eye on territories to the southwest of Rhodesia, Bechuanaland. The chiefs knew that only disaster and exploitation lay ahead for territories if they fell under the control of Rhodes. Though it was impossible for them to defeat Rhodes militarily, they were determined to fight him any way they could. They decided to opt for the lesser of 2 evils, greater control by the British rather than annexation by Rhodes. With the help of the London Missionary Society, they travelled to London to try to persuade Queen Victoria and Joseph Chamberlain, then Colonial Secretary, to take greater control of Bechuanaland and protect it from Rhodes. On September 11, 1895, they had their first meeting with Chamberlain. Sebel spoke first, then Bathoan, and finally Chamberlain declared that he would consider imposing British control to protect the tribes from Rhodes. In the meantime, the chiefs quickly embarked on a nationwide speaking tour to drum up popular support for their requests. They visited and spoke at Windsor and Reading, close to London, in Southampton on the south coast, and in Leicester and Birmingham, in Chamberlain's political support base, the Midlands. They went north to industrial Yorkshire, to Sheffield, Leeds, Halifax, and Bradford. They also went west to Bristol and then up to Manchester and Liverpool. Meanwhile, back in South Africa, Cecil Rhodes was making preparations for what would become the disastrous Jameson Raid, an armed assault on the Boer Republic of the Transvaal, despite Chamberlain's strong objections. These events likely made Chamberlain much more sympathetic to the chief's plight than he might have been otherwise. On November 6, they met with him again in London. The chief spoke through an interpreter. "Chamberlain, I will speak about the lands of the chiefs, and about the railway, and about the law which is to be observed in the territory of the chiefs. Now let us look at the map. We will take the land that we want for the railway, and no more. I say, that if Mr. Chamberlain will take the land himself, I will be content. Chamberlain, then tell him that I will make the railway myself by the eyes of one whom I will send, and I will take only as much as I require, and will give compensation if what I take is of value. I would like to know how, i.e., where, the railway will go. Chamberlain, it shall go through his territory but shall be fenced in, and we will take no land. I trust that you will do this work as for myself, and treat me fairly in this matter. Chamberlain, I will guard your interests." The next day, Edward Fairfield, at the Colonial Office, explained Chamberlain's settlement in more detail. Each of the three chiefs, Sebel and Bathoen, shall have a country within which they shall live as hitherto under the protection of the Queen. The Queen shall appoint an officer to reside with them. The chiefs will rule their own people much as at present. Rhodes's reaction to being outmaneuvered by the three African chiefs was predictable. He cabled to one of his employees, saying, "I do object to being beaten by three canting natives." The chiefs in fact had something valuable that they had protected from Rhodes and would subsequently protect from British indirect rule. By the 19th century, the Tswana states had developed a core set of political institutions. These involved both an unusual degree, by sub-Saharan African standards, of political centralization and collective decision-making procedures that can even be viewed as a nascent, primitive form of pluralism. Just as the Magna Carta enabled the participation of barons into the political decision-making process, and put some restrictions on the actions of the English monarchs, the political institutions of the Tswana, in particular the Kotla, also encouraged political participation and constrained chiefs. The South African anthropologist Isaac Chapra describes how the Kotla worked as follows. All matters of tribal policy are dealt with finally before a general assembly of the adult males in the chief's Kotla, council place. Such meetings are very frequently held. Among the topics discussed are tribal disputes, quarrels between the chief and his relatives, the imposition of new levies, the undertaking of new public works, the promulgation of new decrees by the chief. It is not unknown for the tribal assembly to overrule the wishes of the chief. Since anyone may speak, these meetings enable him to ascertain the feelings of the people generally, and provide the latter with an opportunity of stating their grievances. If the occasion calls for it, he and his advisers may be taken severely to task, for the people are seldom afraid to speak openly and frankly. Beyond the Kotla, the Tswana chieftaincy was not strictly hereditary but open to any man demonstrating significant talent and ability. Anthropologist John Komaroff studied in detail the political history of another of the Tswana states, the Rolong. He showed that though in appearance the Tswana had clear rules stipulating how the chieftaincy was to be inherited, in practice these rules were interpreted to remove bad rulers and allow talented candidates to become chief. He showed that winning the chieftaincy was a matter of achievement, but was then rationalized so that the successful competitor appeared to be the rightful heir. The Tswana captured this idea with a proverb, with a tinge of constitutional monarchy, Kosi Kokosi Ka Moraf. The king is king by the grace of the people. The Tswana chiefs continued in their attempts to maintain their independence from Britain and preserve their indigenous institutions. After their trip to London, they conceded the construction of railways in Bechuanaland, but limited the intervention of the British in other aspects of economic and political life. They were not opposed to the construction of the railways, certainly not for the same reasons as the Austro-Hungarian and Russian monarchs blocked railways. They just realized that railways, like the rest of the policies of the British, would not bring development to Bechuanaland as long as it was under colonial control. The early experience of Kwet Mosier, president of independent Botswana from 1980 to 1998, explains why. Mosier was an enterprising farmer in the 1950s. He developed new cultivation techniques for sorghum and found a potential customer in Vryburg Milling, a company located across the border in South Africa. He went to the railway station master at Lobats in Bechuanaland and asked to rent 2 rail trucks to move his crop to Vryburg. The station master refused. Then he got a white friend to intervene. The station master reluctantly agreed, but quoted Mosier 4 times the rate for whites. Mosier gave up and concluded, it was the practice of the whites, not just the laws prohibiting Africans from owning freehold land or holding trading licenses that kept blacks from developing enterprises in Bechuanaland. All in all, the chiefs, and the Tswana people, had been lucky. Perhaps against all odds, they succeeded in preventing Rhodes's takeover. As Bechuanaland was still marginal for the British, the establishment of indirect rule there did not create the type of vicious circle playing out in Sierra Leone, pages 335 to 344. They also avoided the kind of colonial expansion that went on in the interior of South Africa that would turn those lands into reservoirs of cheap labor for white miners or farmers. The early stages of the process of colonization are a critical juncture for most societies, a crucial period during which events that will have important long-term consequences for their economic and political development transpire. As we discussed in Chapter 9, most societies in sub-Saharan Africa, just as those in South America and South Asia, witnessed the establishment or intensification of extractive institutions during colonization. The Tswana would instead avoid both intense indirect rule and the far worse fate that would have befallen them had Rhodes succeeded in annexing their lands. This was not just blind luck, however. It was once again a result of the interplay between the existing institutions, shaped by the institutional drift of the Tswana people, and the critical juncture brought about by colonialism. The 3 chiefs had made their own luck by taking the initiative and traveling to London, and they were able to do this because they had an unusual degree of authority, compared with other tribal leaders in sub-Saharan Africa, owing to the political centralization that Tswana tribes had achieved, and perhaps they also had an unusual degree of legitimacy, because of the modicum of pluralism embedded in their tribal institutions. Another critical juncture at the end of the colonial period would be more central to the success of Botswana, enabling it to develop inclusive institutions. By the time Bechuanaland became independent in 1966 under the name Botswana, the lucky success of Chief Sebel, Bathoan, and Khama was long in the past. In the intervening years, the British invested little in Bechuanaland. At independence, Botswana was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had a total of 12 kilometers of paved roads, 22 citizens who had graduated from university, and 100 from secondary school. To top it all off, It was almost completely surrounded by the white regimes of South Africa, Namibia, and Rhodesia, all of which were hostile to independent African countries run by blacks. It would have been on few people's list of countries most likely to succeed. Yet over the next 45 years, Botswana would become one of the fastest-growing countries in the world. Today Botswana has the highest per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa, and is at the same level as successful Eastern European countries such as Estonia and Hungary, and the most successful Latin American nations, such as Costa Rica. How did Botswana break the mold? By quickly developing inclusive economic and political institutions after independence. Since then, it has been democratic, holds regular and competitive elections, and has never experienced civil war or military intervention. The government set up economic institutions enforcing property rights, ensuring macroeconomic stability, and encouraging the development of an inclusive market economy. But of course, the more challenging question is, how did Botswana manage to establish a stable democracy and pluralistic institutions, and choose inclusive economic institutions, while most other African countries did the opposite? To answer this, we have to understand how a critical juncture, this time the end of colonial rule, interacted with Botswana's existing institutions. In most of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, for Sierra Leone and Zimbabwe, independence was an opportunity missed, accompanied by the recreation of the same type of extractive institutions that existed during the colonial period. Early stages of independence would play out very differently in Botswana, again largely because of the background created by Tswana historical institutions. In this, Botswana exhibited many parallels to England on the verge of the Glorious Revolution. England had achieved rapid political centralization under the Tudors and had the Magna Carta and the tradition of Parliament that could at least aspire to constrain monarchs and ensure some degree of pluralism. Botswana also had some amount of state centralization and relatively pluralistic tribal institutions that survived colonialism. England had a newly forming broad coalition, consisting of Atlantic traders, industrialists, and the commercially minded gentry, that was in favor of well-enforced property rights. Botswana had its coalition in favor of secure procedure rights, the Tswana chiefs, and elites who owned the major assets in the economy, cattle. Even though land was held communally, cattle was private property in the Tswana states, and the elites were similarly in favor of well-enforced property rights. All this of course is not denying the contingent path of history. Things would have turned out very differently in England if parliamentary leaders and the new monarch had attempted to use the Glorious Revolution to usurp power. Similarly, things could have turned out very differently in Botswana, especially if it hadn't been so fortunate as to have leaders such as Seretse Khama, or Kwet Mosier, who decided to contest power in elections rather than subvert the electoral system, as many post-independence leaders in sub-Saharan Africa did. At independence, the Tswana emerged with a history of institutions enshrining limited chieftaincy, and some degree of accountability of chiefs to the people. The Tswana were of course not unique in Africa for having institutions like this, but they were unique in the extent to which these institutions survived the colonial period unscathed. British rule had been all but absent.